Professor Hans van der Ven and dear participants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our very special webinar on 100 years of Communist Party of China. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. China Studies is one of our major research centers. China Studies as a whole brings into perspective the rising power of mounting economic, military, and diplomatic cloud that certainly has the aptitude to either overturn or sustain the contemporary world order. The center broadly examines China's international strategy thinking and conduct, foreign and security policies, and the impact of domestic politics and economy on China's foreign relations. We have been holding regular interaction on China with experts from around the world. To talk on a very interesting topic of today, we have very distinguished scholar, Professor Hans van der Ven from University of Cambridge. Professor Hans van der Ven is an authority on the history of 19th and 20th century China. At the University of Cambridge, he served as a professor of modern Chinese history. He's a director of studies in Asia and Middle Eastern studies at Cambridge. Educated in the Netherlands at Leiden University and in the United States at Harvard, he's an expert on the history of 19th and 20th century of China. He's a fellow of the British Academy and the author of Breaking with the Past, the Chinese Maritime, Customs Service and the Global Origins of Modernity in China, War and Nationalism in China, 1925 to 1945, and From Friend to Comrade, the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, 1920 to 1927. The Battle of China, a book on essays he co-edited, has received the 2012 Distinguished Book Award of the Society of Military History. Professor Van, we would like to welcome you to our program. We would like to thank you for your valuable time for NICE. Kindly make your remarks in 25 to 30 minutes, which will be followed by question and answers. This program is streaming live on Facebook and several other platforms. We'd like to request our participants to drop their questions on Zoom chat or under Facebook Live. You can also tweet your questions on our WhatsApp. Professor Van, over to you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Can I just make sure that you can hear and see me properly? So
yes,
somebody
we can hear you.
Okay, good. I also have a request. I'm now looking at a screen that is full with little black
on the top, if you go to
friends.
view,
If some of you could put your video on, I get some sense of engagement.
So on the top, if you go to view, you can see a speaker gallery. If you click gallery, you can see everyone's face.
Yes, but I'd like to ask people if at all possible to turn on their video link so I can see some faces.
Okay,
otherwise, I'm just talking to a black screen. It doesn't really matter. And
okay,
so
I'd like to request all
it.
of participants to put on the video.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. And this is just sort of one of those signs where, oh, great, good. Some of you are doing this. This is just one of those signs where, you know, we know we live in a new world and there are great advantages like your invitation to me. And I can talk to you from where I am now, which is actually at Leiden University in the Netherlands. But I don't think we have developed the kinds of customs that make that quite so easy. Like this morning, I was in a conference call with a couple of people in Hong Kong, 20 people. It's a rather high-level political meeting. It involved Carrie Lam, who I'm sure all you know. And in the pre-meeting, we were all discussing whether or not we should be wearing a tie. And of course, I can see that Pramod is wearing a tie. And embarrassingly enough, I'm not. But I don't have it. Since I just arrived here with just a suitcase, I don't have a tie. And I was trying to go out and buy one, but it didn't work. So apologies for that. So what I will try to do today is give you a sense of 100 years of Chinese communist history. And as I'm sure all of you know, the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party this July, 1st of July. which may or may not be the right date. We don't know. The historical documents don't allow us to say whether or not the Chinese Communist Party was actually founded on the 1st of July. But somebody far wiser than any of us, named Mao Zedong, decided that that was going to be the date. So we're going to have to live with it. I think that origin, at least to our minds, of uncertainty is actually rather interesting. It suggests a party that was it was sort of created on the fly. A lot of things were happening. Nobody really knew what I was going to do. Nobody was keeping records. Records were not being preserved. It was all a bit of sort of voluntary, making it up as you go along. And that's the kind of history that is so often forgotten, but is actually really important in this Chinese Communist Party. Now, at the commemoration on this July, I looked at it. I looked at some of it, not all of it. The question in my mind is, what kind of history, what kind of narrative is the Chinese Communist Party trying to convince us needs to be told about its own history? And the conclusion I came to, and I'm sure that most people would do the same, is that this is a narrative of inevitability. It is a narrative of inevitability of a party that had to be founded, that had to make mistakes, but had to find the only way for China to overcome all kinds of problems deriving from imperialism, from warlordism, from capitalism, all those things. And only this party could enable China not just to regain independence, but the key message that Xi Jinping wants to purvey is that it is the only party that can bring back China's greatness, not only as a great military power, but also as a cultural power, as an economic power, etc. So it is a deeply teleological narrative that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to convey to us in this parade. There were some other interesting bits that I hadn't, two interesting bits that I want to mention about the commemoration itself. One was the absence of the military. Now we've become accustomed to large military parades in China. It was a bit of a flyover and all of that, but not the great parades of new missiles that are going to destroy the US Navy, things like that. And of course, the background is there that it is the party that must control the gun, as Mao Zedong said in 1931 or 1932. I don't quite remember. So it's the party that is going to save China. It's not the army. The other element that struck me is an appeal not so much to a rational political line, a series of policies, as we've become used to in sort of 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th Party Congress, but an appeal to emotion. We all need to be passionate about the party. We need to be believers. We need to commit ourselves to the party and everything that we do. I think that was something, and there needs to be sort of an emotionality, passionate emotionality about this. And I'll return to this at the end when I want to say a few things about where China might go from here. You've asked me to talk about the past, but of course, the past can only be thought about in the context of the future, and we think about the future very much in terms of what came before. Now, so if that was the narrative that I think Xi Jinping is trying to purvey, of course, in the West, it was in Europe, United States, kinds of things that I've been watching, the response was much more one of nervousness, of ranging from this deep fear of China, sometimes coming quite close to yellow peril narratives, to sort of very more measured versions of, well, there is going to be a great change in geopolitical order. How do we respond to that? Of course, all very legitimate questions. But I'll come back to that later. So the CCP narrative is one that is teleological. It's not historical. So as historians, we want to do something about that. As historians, we do not like teleologies today, because it suggests an inevitability. And I think one of the things that is very clear to me, at least, that it was nothing inevitable about the rise of the Chinese Communist Party. Context always matter, chance matter, luck mattered, and so on. But you know, the way that the Chinese Communist Party phrases this always is that only the Chinese Communist Party could come up with a 出路, a way out for China, a way out from a past that is badly defined, but is that of imperialism, warlordism, backwardness, economic stagnation, civilizational decline, cultural decline, towards this new future that Xi Jinping keeps talking about. Sort of a revival of China as a significant military, social, economic power, but also culture, a civilization, a society, all by 1949, the second of its centennial goals. Now, I can't, in 10 minutes, give you a really good overview of 100 years of Chinese history. But I think I can, if we ditch the CCP's version of its own past, as was put down in its recently published new short history of the Chinese Communist Party, an interesting document in its own way. If we ditch that and try to think as historians about the past, I and others with whom I've been working, namely Timothy Cheek in Vancouver and Klaus Mühlhahn in Berlin, so that we want to suggest a division. That's what historians do, right? To divide history in somehow significant periods. So if we do that to the Chinese Communist Party, I think we can see sort of 5 periods. And the first would be from 1920 to 1929. I've always thought that we best think of the beginning of the party in 1920, when across China, you have these bright, young, intellectual students, all very different, beginning to read communism and do all kinds of interesting stuff and read all kinds of different kinds of writing, not just communist, but also anarchist and liberal. And they're all terribly, there's a huge intellectual excitement. In some ways, like it was in 1980s China, when I went there for the first time. That period lasted from 1920 to 1929. You get cooperation with the KMT, but you get also the suppression of the CCP by the Chinese Communist Party, first in Shanghai in 1927, and then across China in something that was rightly called the White Terror, when thousands of Chinese communists, of left-wingers, it was not very well defined, were killed. And this is and again, the global context is an important one here, one of a global rise of communism. It's happening in Vietnam, what we now know as Vietnam, Indonesia, India, in Britain, in Europe, et cetera, et cetera. And China, the Chinese Communist Party is very much part of that. Then it is suppressed. And I think the first major instance of luck, of circumstance, of context, really happens when this international global communist movement is suppressed. The leaders of the Communist International in Shanghai are taken prisoner, and because of a series of events, the Chinese Communist Party actually ends up in the countryside. And Mao very famously surprised them. Said, wait a minute, you know, in Marxism, peasants are supposed to be backward and no good. Not a revolutionary force, but what I'm seeing in China, Ray wrote this in 1926, there is this enormous revolutionary enthusiasm. And in that context, he began to build up bases in central China. So sort of, surprise, surprise, there is revolution, but it's not in the cities, as Marxism and Leninism said, as the Communist International said, as the aide from Moscow was saying, but it is in the countryside. And they build up these communist bases in the countryside. But I think that new period in the history of the Chinese Communist Party, I think we can say lasted from 1929, Six-Party Congress, until 1949, so 20 years. And that is what I would say is the period of rural revolutions, the discovery, the maturation, and ultimately the victory of rural peasant revolution in China. And of course, and I'm sure that most of you know this history. It's the Long March. It's setting up of Yan'an, the new communist capital, the new Jerusalem. You get Edgar Snow's Red Star over China. You get the 1940s rectification campaign that is conducted by Mao. And then you get the Chinese Civil War between the KMT and nationalists, and the KMT and the communists, and the communists end up winning that. And here, again, luck and context and circumstance are all key. Mao admitted in 1950 several times. It's now denied in Beijing, but it is true. We have the documents. Mao admitted, as he told Premier Tanaka, the Japanese Premier Tanaka, without a Japanese invasion, we would still be in the hills. We would not have won. We would be no more than a rather irritating rural guerrilla movement somewhere on the borders of China. In some ways, like Maoists are still in India. That fate could have been China's quite easily, but it is, it's what the Japanese invasion mattered in two ways. It created the open spaces, morally, publicly, administratively, economically, behind Japanese lines, that the Chinese communists could fill and then build up these bases that delivered real things to the local population, including some level of security. So there's one element. The other element is that the nationalists, not the communists, but as even Chinese PRC historians now admit, it's the communists, it's the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek who did most of the fighting for the Japanese, against the Japanese, and suffered as a result greatly. And then at the end of the Second World War in 1945, their best armies are actually in Burma and are not that strong anymore. And the nationalists are by then full of corruption. I think the other element of sort of luck here, or of circumstance that is to the benefit of the Chinese communists, is that the Americans go cold on, Roosevelt was trying to build up the nationalists as the fourth great new power that would control the world, organize the world, run the world after 1945. But by 1944, actually, certainly the Americans are really irritated with Chiang Kai-shek, don't believe he is the future, thinks he is the past. They see him as corrupt, militaristic, and therefore they refuse to arm him, and in fact have a great deal of sympathy for the communist, for Mao. In just one of the signs in which, one of the first signs in which the intelligence and effectiveness of communist propaganda is made very clear. So that at 49, the founding of the PRC, the People's Republic, begins a new period in which the communists have to rule, and they follow a period in which, in this period, they lean towards Moscow, and socialist planning, economic planning, centralized planning is adopted. Many Soviet plans are adopted. There's significant Soviet aid until the Sino-Soviet split in the late 1950s, but it doesn't work, right? And there are the troubles of doesn't work not only in, there is significant industrial growth, of course, but the countryside is not improving. And in fact, you have the Great Famine of 59-61, anywhere between 30 to 60 million dead. And then you have the Cultural Revolution, and Mao keeps talking about creating a new order in which sort of the contradictions amongst the people are somewhat less serious, but even, then he himself grows frustrated with the state he has built and launches the Cultural Revolution, which, upends the political structure that he himself has built. And so you might think, again, and at the same time, you have Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong taking off economically, creating trouble. So you think that this would be the typical kind of story that is the basis for containment, the US containment strategies of the Soviet Union. This communism will collapse because of the internal contradictions within its own system. And by the late 60s, early 70s, the Chinese communists seemed well on the way of doing that. Even Chiang Kai-shek begins to think, well, perhaps we can regain the mainland, although the US prevails on him not even tried it. I think again, context in finding a way out is all important in understanding why that happened. And here I should say that, to my mind, the reform period for which Deng Xiaoping is famous, and whose name has been given to it, really does not begin in 1978, as standard history suggests. A better option, as my East China Normal University colleague Han Gang has argued, is actually Hua Guofeng, who talks about the four modernizations and begins many of the reforms that Deng Xiaoping later declares to be his. So in 1976, after the death of Mao, I actually think there's a good case to be made for saying they begin in 1972, when Mao agrees to the opening to the United States. That changes everything. And Mao will, he's smart enough to have been aware of that, jettisoning the Soviets, welcoming people like Kissinger and Nixon, American Republicans, to Beijing, and then slowly throwing open the doors to the West. That is going to change anything. And it is possible, not because of what's happening in China, of course, but because of what's happening in Vietnam and in the Soviet Union. And Kissinger's own belief that he can create a new geopolitical order in which Washington, he thinks in terms of capitals, in which Washington, Beijing, and Moscow are the triangle that he needs to control in order to keep some order in the world. It works. I'm not going to go through the reform period. We all, not people like me, people who are close to retirement like myself have lived through this. Our younger audience members today will no doubt have read about it in their classes. There are lots of, the heyday was the 1980s. It was a wonderful time to be in China. Since then, rather less so. But I'm not going to talk about it today. I think with the rise of Xi Jinping, his appointment to the presidency and election as General Secretary in 2012 begins a really new period. And that period I'm going to call, and I'm following here people like Tim Cheek and Klaus Müller have already talked about, this is a counter-reformation. We can think of it, as a counter-reformation as you had in the Catholic Church in Europe. It's a cleansing operation, a return to old certainties. It's an internal hunt for deviance or supposed deviance. It's a re-centralization of power. It's a re-articulation of fundamental doctrine that are meant to be sacred, etc., etc., etc. And where it will go, in the last few months, have been significant recent developments in that. But think of it as a counter-reformation. I'm going to run out of time, which is inevitable if we talk about 100 years of history. But one of the things that I do want to bring out a couple more things. And one is that we think of the history of the CCP as this, a series of political lines pursued by various leaderships that then overthrow each other or rejected what each other had to say. But actually defining what the Chinese Communist Party was and is, what it really stood for, is difficult. And I don't think it is as monolithic as is suggested in most histories. It's certainly not as monolithic as Xi Jinping or Mao were trying to tell us. And I think we can think of three major traditions within that, intellectual traditions within the Chinese Communist Party. And there are lots of other traditions outside it in China, but there's no time in going into those. The first I want to mention is what I would call an intellectual humanist tradition. And the Chinese Communist Party, for various reasons that have to do with political practice in China, needed the support of the intellectuals, because the intellectuals were sort of the moral arbiters. Without the intellectuals, you can't operate. It's been true in imperial times as well as today. And the party began out of that intellectual tradition. When you have all these people, reading, talking, discussing, these are communist seminars rather than even party branches, all very excited. And I think this kind of humanist intellectual tradition keeps coming back. I mean, it's suppressed now, of course. There's very little chance for open debate, but it's there. It was there strongly in the late 1930s, early 1940s, when you have people like Wang Shiwei actually criticizing Mao in Yan'an. What kind of, that took guts to do. And I see some nodding heads, so I trust people know what I'm talking about. You had them in the 1980s, when I was privileged to meet some who, talking endlessly into the night with guitars in the background and drinking, great fun. But people like, at that time, Dai Zheng, very famous, of course. But Wang Wei would be another one. In the 40s, I already mentioned, Wang Ming actually is a representative of that, venerated because of his knowledge, a challenger to Mao because of his knowledge. Even Guo Moro, he might not like Guo Moro, quite doctrinaire, but he also wrote pieces that were actually implicitly critical of Mao. And of course, the Cultural Revolution begins with intellectual criticism of Mao by people like Wu Han, Deng Tuo, San Jiachuan, and so on. So I think that intellectual humanist tradition is there. Li Wenhua is a more recent example of my sense of intellectuals today, of in the last, before the 2000s, let's put it that way, the noughties, was one of increasing disillusionment, but also not wanting to give up actually on the party, saying this is my party just as much as yours. So I think that's sort of a tradition we really have to keep in mind. And the other tradition for which there's very little attention, extremely important, is the cosmopolitan tradition. The Communist Party grows out of an international communist movement. I've already mentioned the 1920s, when it is Chinese. Well, just one example is that many of the more the high achieving early generation people, including Deng Xiaoping, actually, they join international communism in Paris, where they sit around with all kinds of European intellectuals, as well as Ho Chi Minh, as well as people from India, like Nehru, or Indonesia, like Muhammad Hatta. It is that kind of cosmopolitan background that comes back during the first phase of the Second World War in China, 1930s, 1970s. Of course, it was back in the 1980s. And well, I guess I'm talking to people in Nepal. They know about the international ramifications of Maoism far better than I ever will, because I don't know anything really about. So it's, what I'm trying to point out is that this not only affected China, it also affected Europe, South Asia, Southeast Asia. You can see it, and you can see my colleague Julia Lovell has written about that, international Maoism. It had an impact on the Black Panther movement in the United States. It had an impact on the subaltern school of thinking in India. It had an impact in France, for instance, on Foucault, and so on. So when we think about Chinese communism, we have to see both the international cosmopolitan backgrounds of what Chinese communists are saying, but also the international impact of Maoism itself, and not say this is completely separate. It isn't. We need a global perspective to that. And then there is the Maoist tradition, the critically Maoist tradition, that takes control really in the rectification campaign of the 1940s, and which I'm sure everybody agrees is one of the inspirations, one of the origins for the kind of Chinese Communist Party, the kind of Chinese society that Xi Jinping is trying to build or rebuild today, apparently with a considerable amount of success. For how long is a different question. I think an element that is, to my mind, still talked about far too little is one of the whole question of violence in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. It's no surprise that 20th century history, which is no news that the 20th century history was deeply violent. But the Chinese Communist Party also was a tool of violence. And I have described Mao himself as a supreme engineer of violence. He really understood violence and was able to use it for his own purposes, better than I think Machiavelli or Clausewitz ever could have imagined. He read Clausewitz. Whether or not he read Machiavelli, I don't know, but I would not be surprised. And this is not just the violence that comes, that is, let's say, the basis of rural revolution, of creating a rural base in a base in a rural society that has the power to take on imperialist countries or the KMT. That itself was a major discovery, a major creation, which of course shaped revolution across the world, not just outside China. But I think it's in some ways, especially the other forms of violence that I'm interested in, and why I call him one of the profoundest engineers of violence. When I understand violence, read Mao. And in fact, we know that Al-Qaeda and ISIS do exactly that. They have read their Mao. They know what they're trying to do. It is also violence in order to control your own following. It is also violence turned inside. It is violence used, for instance, in the rectification campaign, and in the Cultural Revolution, and in the Great Leap Forward. And my sense is that Mao had a really good sense of what you could do in that way, in having these internal purges. And we think of these purges as excesses, as somehow these are horrible things that happen when things are out of control. And then people regain their sense of normality, of objectivity, they become rational again. I think forget it. Mao really knew what was going to do, and he knew how to orchestrate a period of purges like that. It is also violence that is not physically violent, but is the violence against internal identities. And that in some ways begins, I think, in the defeat of 1926, 1928, the Great Revolution, which leads, for instance, people like Moreau, for an internal questioning of the self. What is wrong with me that I failed to do what communists suggest is to gain power and change the world? Why are we not changing the world? Well, it's because internal deficiencies. It is the deficiencies of the self, and they need to change. We need to have that transformation of the self. And I think I need to think this further through, but it's that kind of stuff, of course, that leads to self-criticism, violence, self-regulation intellectually, but also the kinds of things that happened in the Cultural Revolution and the Zhiwo Piping, the self-criticism, are happening today once more. So it's violence, it's symbolic violence against the self, and I think that is just as significant. Well, it's not just, it's a different kind of violence, perhaps, but it's violence nonetheless. And I think Mao had a real understanding of these three kinds of violence and was able to manipulate them for his own purposes with enormous effectiveness. So now let me return finally to beginning, to Xi Jinping. What is he going to do? I suspect that sort of these phrases that we hear of him, of Xi Jinping trying to create or creating with a digital surveillance authoritarian state are an apt description in many ways, but not completely. It is a reformation. I guess my sense of worry for the future comes from the fact that these kinds of periods of intensification of internal party control, of self-criticism sessions, of re-energizing the dogma, of the centralization of power, of rectification. They tend to happen when we look at history before major elements of war. This happened in the 30s, the 40s, 50s, and the 60s. And so that is one reason that I am concerned about what the future might hold. And the future is going to be difficult in any case. And let's keep in mind that no power has risen to great power status without a whole lot of trouble and violence all around the world. This is true for my own country, Holland, the country I was born. This is true for the United States. It's for the country where I now build my home, the UK. And it'd be surprising indeed if China was different. When that whether if that moment has come, who knows? But I think there is this. So if China sort of seems to me now sort of battling down the hatchets before some big confrontation is going to be made, some big kind of exercise is going to be made. So that makes me nervous. I hope I'm wrong, of course, for the sake of all of us. And maybe I'm misreading it. Maybe there's no justification for this. Living on the periphery of China, I'm sure you have far better insight of where things might go. There are other ways of seeing this. This is an insecure regime that is just hoping that it might just survive and end up in some safer waters. So, the future, as I guess I build in my own excuse by saying that history was shaped as much by context as by human will. I can point to context and human will today and say, who knows where all this is going to go? I don't. And context and luck and chance will always matter. And they are impossible to predict. So I'm not actually going to make a prediction. But so, Pramod, I hope that gives a sense of the richness, the diversity, the kinds of historical questions that remain open. And I suppose my last word is this, that in 29, the Chinese Communist Party was down and out. In 35, it was down and out. In 49, so either 18 years after its founding, or 28 years after its founding, 20 years after its first disaster, and a merely 14 years after 35 disaster, it was in power. The Chinese Communist Party had become the most powerful political party in the world. It is an amazing story. It is worth our time and effort to try to comprehend it. But with that, Pramod, I hand back to you.
Thank you, sir. Professor Hans van der Ven, thank you so much for the interesting lecture. It was really enlightening presentation and we learned a lot. Thank you so much for this effort. We have received lots of questions. I can see around 50 of them, and I'm sure it will be double in a few minutes because you have just completed lecture. Hence, without wasting any time, let me share some of the questions. I'll try to club one or two questions so that it's easy for you to answer them. Let me first start with, like most of the communist parties around the world have deep internal conflict. Is there any such two-line struggle or intra-party conflict in CPC? That is first. Second, around the world, Communist Party are defeated in elections and are struggling for its existence. What is the future of CPC? How is CPC getting stronger day by day? Do you think CPC can survive another 100 years? I'll try to club a few questions together. So,
all right, thank you. That's great. The internal struggle question is, of course, interesting. I think I must first of all make clear that I'm utterly convinced there are internal struggles, of course. We just have to mention Boursilai, who was a, just as likely new Secretary General as Xi Jinping, in 2012. He is now in jail. The Chinese Communist Party usually writes its own history as a struggle between two lines, because it follows a Stalinist model within that. Historians in Europe and the United States, elsewhere, who have written about the Chinese Communist Party, therefore, say there is no such thing as a two-line struggle. It's more complicated than that. And I think that is true. But I think you should also say that, unfortunately, power in China has never been transparent. Politics has never been transparent. It will not be transparent. So anybody who says they know precisely what kinds of struggles are taking place doesn't know. We don't know. We really, really don't. We can have some sense of it. You know, when we travel to China, we pick up bits of information, of course. I'm sure there are intelligence operations who can do good work on this. There are no doubt AI and social media organizations that actually got a good sense from surveying Chinese social media. But how it really is inside the party, I don't know. We really don't know. But there are all kinds of struggles. And something like what Xi Jinping, that, you know, from we know a little bit about history, but from more recently, you know, CCP's crackdown, jailing. Of course, people are angry and mad and are waiting for a turn to come even. Or, you know, I guess one of the dangers of his decision to end term limits for the presidency, thereby opening the way for him to rule for more than 10 years, is that there will be a range of very significant leaders in China who might have hoped that one day they could be president, and that hope might now not exist. They will also, so that opens up a very difficult struggle for succession, which Deng Xiaoping had hoped to solve by collective leadership and obligatory retirement and you know, a collective decision about who was going to be the next president and secretary general. So that has created a new level of volatility in Chinese politics. We'll find out next year how volatile that will be. I suspect not then. As to the future of the CCP, of course, no Chinese Communist Party. The reason that 100th anniversary of the CCP is so remarkable is that no party has ever lasted, no Communist party has ever lasted that long, nor has it held power. There's no Communist Party held power for so long. So there must have been a considerable anxiety among the Chinese Communist Party. But, you know, why is it? I mean, the question therefore is, why is it that the Chinese Communist Party has lasted that long? And the various answers are possible to that. In talking about a recent book that I and others, centenary of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party is centenary 10 lives. People have asked is, do you think the party exists in 10, 20, 50, 100 years? I think 10 years, I put a significant amount of money on. The Chinese Communist Party today is the most powerful political party that has ever been built. It has an economic base to die for. It has armies and fleets and missiles and nuclear arms to die for. It has an economy that's, you know, enormously powerful. And it has a base, it is, you know, it penetrates every nook and cranny in Chinese society, including social media, of course, through AI now. So it is tremendously powerful, and I can't see that easily given up, being eroded in 10 years. 20 years always becomes more difficult. You know, things happen in history, and you know, as I said, you know, really things do happen. 50 years, who knows? I think the point to make here is that there has been a revolution in China, and it tends to take countries a long time to find a new stable politics after that. You know, after the French Revolution, it took, well, maybe until after de Gaulle before France found some stability. in the United States, the revolution, no, it was not really until after the Civil War, perhaps even later, to the 1860 Civil War, so maybe a century later, that some stability reappeared. A communist party is an instrument for revolution. That's how Lenin designed it. And then the state and the party were supposed to wither away. It is not an organization for stable rule. So I think, therefore, that, yeah, the Chinese Communist Party will probably last for another 10 years in the way that it exists today. It might last 100 years, but only if it finds ways to create that stable politics. I mean, whether that's in its name or not is a different question. But change and transformation are in order before, at least I think, that stability has been achieved. I think just one sign of that, of course, is, you know, this talk about Hong Kong and especially Taiwan. Xi Jinping seems to say we cannot have a stable China until we have Taiwan back. The Taiwanese don't agree.
Let me move to the next set of questions. I've tried to club a few together. How has CPC transformed in last 100 years? Many critics also mention that China is no longer a communist country and are capitalist, revisionist, and many others. How do you look at it? There's another question, is China really a communist? Another, you were mentioning about AI. So it is said that China is using massive surveillance. With the arrival of AI, the central government would be able to control the public opinion, read their demands, and probably address them as well. In such a situation, how long can CPC last? Okay.
Great questions. Once again, absolutely superb. I have a sort of a bit of a standard question, unsurprisingly, I think, about whether China's communist or capitalist, or whether, you know, whether this is fake communism and real capitalism, or capitalism with Chinese characteristics, as it was sometimes called, the Chinese characteristics meaning corruption and so on. I guess my stock answer to that is, I think it's the wrong question. I don't think there is any, I think the relationship, what we're talking about here, is the relationship between political authority, the government, state, and business and private society, especially business in this case. And I think the relationship that exists today really is not that different as existed in imperial times, pre-1911, pre-1912. So my own supervisor, Philip Kuhn, once put, you know, people like Zheng Guofan or Li Hongjiang or whatever, that was the Yongjing emperor, the Chinese emperors, would not have been surprised by what Deng Xiaoping has done. And that is to say that, yes, merchants, private citizens can do a lot of things much better than the state ever can, than the government ever can. That's why you get the grain traders, for instance, in traditional times. But it is also idiotic to say that they're not working for their own selfish interests and are ruling for the public good. So therefore, the state must have ultimate control. So I don't think that the Yongjing Emperor or the Qianlong Emperor or whoever would be at all surprised by what happened during the reform period. The state retaining ultimate control while letting merchants make China rich, doing the things that they are good at. And clearly Xi Jinping's crackdown on Tencent, on Didi Chuxing, and so on, actually really fits that particular pattern quite well. He decided that they were beginning to damage society, in his views. Now, whether Xi Jinping has the right idea, but public good is a different matter. But he decided, as person in authority, I must clamp down on this. And I think Jack Ma recognized immediately what was happening and responded in a similar. So for me, it's not communism versus capitalism. It's a continuation of a particular constitutional concept, actually, that has underpinned Chinese politics, Chinese state for a long time. AI, surveillance, etc. Yes, of course, China has more surveillance cameras per capita than I think any country in the world. Although I think I must admit that the UK is the second, which says something about the UK, which bears thinking about. The Communist Party or the officials think, therefore, that they have an argument for saying that they are more democratic because they know better what actually is in the minds of the Chinese population than a democratic system based on one vote, one person, one vote might do. Again, there's something to that. You can see AI and surveillance cameras and surveillance technologies as actually facilitating authoritarianism. Don't like the word, but because they do, there's a vast amount of data that does give insight in what is happening at the lowest level. Always one of the weaker points of authoritarian regime, losing that insight. Whether I agree or not is different. I think where the difference here is that it is also, sort of as Marx's colleague recently argued, there is also a homogenization going on, trying to create a uniformity across China that I think is actually inimical to China is a hugely diverse country with enormous regional differences, and to try to create a homogeneous country out of that is very, very difficult. And I think it will run, there is again, I think it's one of those long-standing Chinese traditions. Chinese society is extremely good at maintaining these differences, but also in subordinating official authority and going ahead and doing their own thing in any case. That seems to me part of the kinds of political arrangement that exist. Yes, we must pay due obeisance to the emperor. That doesn't mean we can't do our own thing at the same time. I often compare the Chinese Communist Party to sort of the Catholic Church, and I think a similar sort of habits prevail in the Catholic Church, at least that I knew, where the Pope in Rome says one thing, we in church say yes, and then go off and do our own thing. And one of the strengths of Communist Party really should be its adaptability to local conditions within certain conditions. So this tightening centralization, I'm not sure it's going to go very far. It tends to create more trouble than it's worth. I think that's what I have to say about these questions, Pramod. So back to you.
Thank you, sir. Let me move to other two questions. How has the party reacted to the outside influence, and how has it turned out on foreign policy? That is one. Do you think the CPC is or will expand their belief abroad, their philosophy abroad? That is another question. We've got lots of questions on the future of CPC and all. Like, there's one very interesting question, that who would succeed Xi Jinping? Maybe if you'd like to answer.
There are a lot of questions there. I missed your second one about foreign policy. Could you repeat that?
How has the party reacted to the outside influence, and how has it turned out to foreign policy, the influence from other countries?
Yeah, all right. I think these are all sort of about the CCP today, and I'm an historian, and I saw a question about Taliban. I would hope that you're probably in a far better position than I am to talk about that, and I'd be very interested in your views. All I have is a few headlines from, the Western press. This is where I really miss not being able to go to China, because then you can have conversations with people in China about topics like that, and it is just not possible. My sense would be that the Taliban fits into a series of extremely complicated border problems, as well as religious problems, with which the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing is going to have to deal. That is one of, and that leads to foreign policy too. I think that's in the West, at least, in the United States and in Europe, it is not recognized sufficiently sort of how difficult the complicated, and they may not making it easy for themselves, but China is in a very difficult geographical position with all kinds of complex border problems all around it, from Japan to Korea to Russia, Siberia, Mongolia, Afghanistan, Tibet, India, Nepal, Vietnam, Burma, etc. You know, that is just hugely complicated, and everybody, I think, in the region will understand that, but I don't think it's fully understood in the UK. I mean, it's so different from the United States, which, you know, if President Trump found it difficult to deal with Mexico, which is no threat to it whatsoever, and believed he had to build this enormous wall to contain it, then just imagine how complex, you know, nobody's going to, you know, Canada is not, neither Canada or New Mexico are serious challenges to Washington's authority, to America's authority around the world. And, you know, and so all kinds of regional issues, and that needs to be better understood. China's foreign policy, I think what is different today, and again, which should be more grasped more widely, it is not just that China is a military, economic, political power, which of course builds a presence around the world and thinks geopolitically and wants to have a say in how the world is run. These are all, that's not, I think, what I think is different under Xi Jinping from Deng Xiaoping is that Deng Xiaoping said, we're not going to have any foreign problems, and we need security and peace in order to develop, and of course was right. But also, I think at that, in Deng Xiaoping's time, there was still the idea that somehow the UK and the United States, or the West, as it is put, we can talk about the West more as a concept than as a territory, actually. The West somehow has the answer. You know, we talked about sort of the end of history as a certain way of doing things and running the show, and the West is having won, and that's how things should be around the world and the rest of the world. And I think that confidence that China is now, as you know, one person I admire greatly in Singapore, Wang Gungwu, said, great historian, said, you know, what is different, the shift really is that China has a new confidence, not necessarily in everything, and will not reject everything from the West. We know that would not be right, but it has a confidence in its own past, and especially in its own ability to come up with the right answers. And that, I think, is reflected in much of what Deng Xiaoping is saying. You know, we're not simply going to listen. And we have good ideas too. And whether Washington or London or Paris or Berlin are actually ready to say at some point, yeah, there's a lot we don't agree with, but actually this we think is a good idea. That hasn't happened yet, but that will happen too at some point, I'm sure. So I think I've talked a little bit about the future of the CCP. Beyond 10 years, I make no predictions. There are going to be transformations. I mean, there are new generations coming through in China who are talking about, at least from the little I know, they're talking about very different things and they face a similar set of problems as young people around the world, which is silly real estate prices, pension problems, low wages, ridiculous working hours, and huge debt. And at the same time, they are extremely well educated, often abroad, and you know, that will change. And I think the other factor that will really impact on China's future, there's debate about this, but I think it really matters, is the demographic change. China became powerful and rich at a wonderfully opportune moment when it had a very large, highly educated population which had no children or very few children to support, and also very few parents to support because they were still healthy. All that's going to change. I think demographic change really is going to reshape China's future. All kinds of new social, financial pressures that are really going to count. Okay.
We are running out of time, so we'll try to club more questions together. First is like, how do you assess the 100 years of CPC and its contribution to the humanity and oppressed class, society, nation, and country? Second is, do you consider that the Chinese model of communism is an alternative to Western liberal democracy? Third is, how do you look at, what do you think about the future of communism and Maoism in the world, and how would China try to influence it?
Wow.
3 questions. Okay.
Wow. Oh dear. How do I assess Chinese communism? I think I've tried to, I think as a historical force, you have to put this in a very much larger context. And that is, for an historian, of course, it is the collapse of imperial China, of the agricultural, bureaucratic, dynastic system that ran China from whatever, the first emperor, with a few big gaps, really, that don't always get mentioned. So it's within that collapse of an old order, combined with the challenge of sort of Western industrial economic capitalist success. I mean, I think the way to put that is in 1800, the Chinese economy was still 50% of the world economy. And by 1900, it was just 5%. So that's an enormous challenge. And the recovery from that is what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to do. So it's in response to a huge political change, an attempt to reform Chinese society, Chinese economy, etc. How do I assess it? On one hand, you can say, well, it has actually delivered the goods in a way that no communist party around the world has done. And in that sense, it's a much deeper challenge. This is a communist authoritarian system that has delivered at least the economic goods. It thereby undermines most of what we have thought about historical change, about how to manage an economy, how to create a modern society, how progress works. So it is a huge intellectual challenge, and one that it's not enough time to really go into that. But don't underestimate the actually intellectual challenge the success of the Chinese Communist Party poses for us. And again, we'll have to see what happens politically or socially, but it has delivered the goods. So that, I think, is one assessment, and that I haven't read anything that I sort of convincingly theorizes that. Let's put it that way. Now, there is talk, and I think that's what the question refers to, is there a China model, a Beijing model, that is Beijing consensus even, that is an alternative to the Washington consensus? Sort of the end of history idea of liberal democracy wins, delivers the goods, and that's it, end of history, job done. We can close our departments and retire or find a new career in AI. No, I don't think there's a China model at all, actually. China's much too diverse for that. There was not a model that you can a model that consists of 4 points and 5 Excel sheets, and that can be applied to other countries or other societies in different times. And history doesn't work that way. So it's not an alternative. It's not a model, and I think we might think, in the wake of Afghanistan, we may think of decline of America, decline of the American empire, and so on. Well, but don't count America out too soon. It still has 300 bases around the world and is still a major economy with enormous vitality. and again, is it a Beijing model, or is it a China model, or are we really talking about something that emerged around with the if we think about the financing of China's economic reforms, then it is something in which capital markets around the world, as well as Hong Kong, Shanghai, Taipei in some ways, but also Tokyo, all participated. So there might be sort of a Pacific fringe element to this. So anything that reduces this to a model, I think it's too easy. I would pay a lot of attention to sort of hub theories. Economic change happened around key significant hubs, be they Dongguan in Hong Kong, in Beijing, in Shanghai, Hong Kong itself, and also sort of more inland areas. And I think these were all probably quite distinct. So is the China model an alternative to democracy? Well, no. There's a lot of things wrong with democracy. Of course there is. One of the things that's good about it is that we can change leaders, and ultimately there is accountability. There's also, and I think there's democracy, and for democracy you need a free press, and a free press is absolutely key in all kinds of ways, and it doesn't exist in China now. I suspect we're running out of time. I'm sort of gibbering on here, so I'm going to hand it back again to you, Pramod.
So we are running out of time, but if you allow, maybe we can take two more last questions.
Absolutely.
Okay. Like PRC will celebrate its 100 years in 2049. Will CPC survive till then? If yes, where will PRC place itself in 2049? That is first. Second is, will CPC success pose threat to fragile democracies? Do you think it is more of a power play rather than an ideological battle? These are the last two questions.
Good. Okay. Will the PRC or the CCP, the PRC might survive, of course, without the CCP. I mean, this is not entirely impossible to think that it being some upheaval that allows the PRC to continue to exist and the CCP and to fade away. In fact, in the 1980s, that was a really serious possibility when there was a lot of talk about separating not only the party from the government, but also the army from the government. As long as the army is under CCP control, then of course that separation isn't going to happen. And the CCP has the real power. But that debate was had, it is remembered. And so is debates about democracy, 1978. And even there's this of the older generation that is now facing the end of days. They are producing memoirs that actually talk about democratic moments, possibilities in the 70s. So 20 years, long time, and there will be surprises along the way. My sense is that the CCP will, I think my hope, my optimism about the future, I'm an optimistic person, and we have to be optimistic in these days of terrible polarization. But I'm optimistic because one thing that the Chinese Communist Party has always shown is an enormous capacity to learn from its mistakes and to change. So the CCP, in some ways unlike the Soviet Communist Party, really has a capacity, internal capacity for change. That's, in the face of real difficulties, when it is pushed to the wall, it has changed and it will change. In some ways, then it becomes a natural party of government capable of changing largely in order to maintain its hold on power, rather like the Tory party in the UK. So I think change will happen, and most likely the change will come from within. To push, to sort of demand China. I mean, I think the lesson is that when these ideas that China would change as it learned to become modern within the WTO and learned our ways, so to speak, Western ways, That has not happened. And I think we need to learn the lesson from that. But change from within is not out of the question. Now, is the Chinese Communist Party a threat to democracy? Yes, it is. As I said, it has delivered the goods. It is, people around the world will look at it and will think, well, what can we learn from this? Is there stuff there that we can imitate in order to make our own societies prosperous and rich, and clearly have a deal with an emergent middle class where it is allowed to have fun and enjoy the nice things of life, and educate their children, probably really important, educate their children properly, without having democracy. I suspect that case is makeable, and has been. So yes, it is a challenge to democracy. And the idea that what is the 1980s, 1990s idea that there's a new wave of democracy, the Samuel Huntington argument, that's clearly proved wrong. Is China a challenge to democracy? That's one part of my answer. The other part of my answer is that democracies are really not helping themselves right now. Both corruption, people like Trump in the United States, the troubles around Brexit in Europe, the invasion of other countries, especially in the Middle East, these are not advertisements for the benefits of democracy. So I hope that democracy too will renew itself and starts to do better than it has. So how about that for a very even-handed and therefore probably fairly useless answer, Pramod?
Thank you, Professor Hans van der Weggen. Thank you so much for your interesting discussion. We are really honored by your kind presence today. We really learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience immensely benefited from it. We still have around 57 questions, but we have to apologize from our audience for not accommodating them due to time constraints. Maybe we'll have Professor Wen again in the future. Professor Wen, I, on behalf of NICE and all the audience, would like to thank you for your kind presence and valuable time. We hope to have you in Kathmandu in future. I would also like to thank all our audience for their wonderful questions. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.